Hello and welcome to Business on the Wire. I'm Mitali Mukherjee. At the COP26 summit in Glasgow, where everything about climate is being discussed, Prime Minister Modi has set out some ambitious targets and some that have set off a bit of a debate. First, of course, the headline moment for India, which is that a net zero target has finally been set for 2070. Part of this, of course, could be a function of global pressure and some global pushback on setting out a definitive date. In that sense, 2070 is more or less middle ground in terms of how achievable the target looks for India, and so as also not to come across as anti-poor in terms of suddenly scaling back on its targets and compromising the state of living for the very poor in India. Some of the other standout moments in that speech include the fact that non-fossil energy capacity will be hiked up to 500 gigawatts by 2030. That basically means 50% of the country's energy requirements, and I assume we're talking about electricity here specifically, will be met by renewable sources. He also talked about the fact that 1 billion ton reduction will be seen in the projected emission. This is all, of course, up to 2030. While many of these did cause quite a bit of chatter globally, and of course there was that net zero moment for India as well, it's interesting that it's coming at complete odds with what's happening domestically. As we speak, some very, very key legislation changes are being considered for the Forest Act that could actually have a deep impact on deforestation and how we've managed to protect that so far. There have been, of course, sweeping changes on many other facets of the environmental laws as well, something that has seen pushback but has gone through. Does it look like international posturing may come at the cost of domestic damage to our environment and to our own climate goals? Joining me to talk about all of that and the various facets of this COP26 summit speech by Prime Minister Modi is Mr. Jairam Ramesh, Senior Leader of the Congress, Member of Parliament, and someone who has handled the Environment Ministry as well. Thank you, Mr. Ramesh, for joining in and speaking with me. Let's start with what was the standout feature for you and what you heard from the COP26 summit from India's commitments.
Well, the COP26 summit is going to continue for another, 10 days. It's not over. We've had the headline announcements. The real nitty-gritties are still remaining to be done. I mean, the blanks of the Paris Agreement, how the Paris Agreement is going to be monitored, reported, and verified, still not been finalized.
Yeah.
So I think the nitty-gritties remain, but the announcements by the heads of state or heads of government have occupied the last 2 days. Mm-hmm. And they've grabbed the headlines undoubtedly.
For India in specific, there's finally a figure on that net zero target on which I imagine there was some global pushback as well.
The net zero target is a bogus target, Mitali. It's completely bogus. This net zero was a concept invented by the Europeans and the climate evangelists of the world, of the Western world, in order to ensure that their commitments in the 2020s and the 2030s, is kept in the background, and we take some distant target for 2050 or 2060 or 2070, when most of us won't be around to hold ourselves accountable. So I've been saying for the last 1 year that this net zero, look at what net zero means. Net zero means what you're putting in is equal to what you're taking out. The technology for putting in is very well known, very well established. But the technology for taking out, is still on the books. It's still, embryonic. Carbon sequestration and storage, CCS, the carbon sequestration and storage technology is not fully developed. Even sequestration through forests is very debatable.
Yeah.
So, this notion that we will somehow come up with some magic wand for taking carbon out of the atmosphere, equal to the amount of carbon we're putting into the atmosphere, is largely a bogus idea today. And I have never been enthusiastic about this net zero concept.
Why do you think
It's an aspirational goal. It's an aspirational goal, and frankly, making commitments. Europe made commitments for 2030. China made a commitment for 2060. So India has made a commitment for 2070 on the very sound principle of China plus 10. But I don't see, I don't see that really having much meaning. I think the other commitments that have been made by countries for the 2030s have a greater meaning. And what does it mean for peaking? That is important. What the Chinese have said is while that they will be net zero by 2060, they will peak by 2030. Now, will they actually peak by 2030? That remains to be seen. And what is the mechanism for holding them internationally accountable? Not domestically accountable, but internationally accountable for peaking in 2030. I'm just taking the Chinese example, as an illustration. So I'm not terribly excited by this 2070 thing, frankly.
I do want to talk about the 2030 goals in more detail, but why do you think they decided to use that platform to talk about this net zero target, Mr. Ramesh, then? Because,
everybody was expecting India.
Is it possible?
Yeah, I mean, there was pressure on India. The Europeans had announced it. China had announced it. India, the world's third largest emitter. So, there was pressure. There was pressure on India. But I don't think, to me, I'm left cold by the 2070. It's an aspirational thing. It's a good thing that, India has recognized the need for decarbonization. I remember 11 years ago, in 2011, when I set up for the first time an expert group in the then Planning Commission for working out a low carbon growth strategy, I was criticized by Mr. Arun Jaitley and Mr. Narendra Modi and by many others in the BJP for even using the word low carbon. Saying that I am mortgaging India's development prospects and that this is all a Western concept and we should not be getting into this. So I am glad that at least at Glasgow, the Prime Minister has acknowledged that there is a pathway that India has to follow for decarbonization, which used to be a bad word 10 years ago, 11 years ago. It shows you how the political discourse has changed dramatically.
Let's talk about some of the 2030 targets. Non-fossil energy, for example. Does that seem like we have the runway in place to achieve the targets that we set?
In the Paris Agreement, India made a commitment that we will have 40% of our electricity, whether it was generation or capacity, was left vague. That 40% of our electricity would come. Let's assume it's capacity, but there's a big difference between generation and capacity. But let's assume for the time being that there's capacity, that 40% of capacity would come from non-fossil fuels. Now, to me, when it was made in 2015, it was not a big deal because already in 2015, about 28% of our electricity capacity was coming from non-fossil fuel. Nuclear accounted for about 3%, gas for about 2%. You had solar and wind for about 6%, and you had hydel for about 16 to 17%. So already in 2015, about 29% of our electricity generation capacity was non-fossil fuel. And what we said in Paris is that this 29 will become 30 over a 15-year period. So, it was a very modest level of ambition. Now, Mr. Modi in Glasgow has upped that 40% to 50%. And I presume that when he uses the word electricity generation, he's actually talking of supply and not just capacity. So it's a continuation of a trend. It was a commitment made in Paris. The Paris commitment in turn were based on commitments that we had first unveiled Dr. Manmohan Singh and I had first unveiled in Copenhagen in 2009, and subsequently I had spoken about it in Cancun in 2010. But it's interesting that when I first said this in 2009 and 2010, I was bitterly attacked in Parliament and bitterly attacked in the media for mortgage, as I said, for mortgaging India's sovereignty and development prospects and so on. But then in 2015, we enshrined these commitments as part of the Paris Agreement, which is a good step forward. I welcome it. I welcomed it. And what Mr. Modi has done in Glasgow has increased that 40% to 50%.
Even so, does the math make sense, Mr. Ramesh? 500 gigawatts by 2030. It means that our renewable installers need to quadruple the rate of deployment. So we're talking about 45 gigawatts every year for the rest of the decade. Basically, as another analyst pointed out, this is equivalent to building the UK's entire renewable fleet.
Yeah, I mean, it's an aggressive target. It's an ambitious target. And there have been very, very bold statements made by the two A's, by Mr. Ambani and Mr. Adani, about the future investments that they're going to be making in green energy, particularly in solar energy. So it's an ambitious target. It's, as I said, it's an aggressive target. But the point I want to stress is that we shouldn't be looking only narrowly at capacity additions, because what this means is a complete re-architecturing of the grid. This is what the Germans did. They just didn't add solar power plants. They re-architectured, re-engineered the entire grid. And I think that's what we really ought to be looking at. I have no doubt in my mind that if solar prices continue being what they are today, less than 3 rupees a unit, hovering around 2 rupees 50 paise a unit. It's very cost competitive with coal. It's cost competitive with nuclear. And even with storage, even with battery storage, it remains cost competitive. So I have no, I have no doubt in my mind that, this is the road to follow. They've been, when I was minister, for example, in 2009, solar prices were over 15 rupees a unit. So we had a modest target of solar of 20 gigawatts by the year 2022. Now today, solar prices are less than 3 rupees a unit. And so the government has taken full advantage of the falling prices and has upped that solar target manifold. And I think that's to be welcomed. However, what we have to recognize that even with all this aggressive additions on renewable, we will still in the next 10 to 15 years require baseload capacity coming from coal or nuclear.
Yeah.
That's the cruel choice, what I have called many years ago the cruel conundrum as far as India is concerned. Now, nuclear, unfortunately, today accounts only for about less than 3.5% of our capacity, and under the most optimistic of assumptions, will reach about 5% by the year 2040. In which case, we will continue to require coal. We will continue to have about 35 or 40% of our electricity generating capacity coming from coal. And that's why I've called for a phase down strategy for coal, not a phase out strategy. Now, it's possible 5 years from now, it's possible in the near future, there will be dramatic changes in battery storage. Costs will come down dramatically. And therefore, the requirement for baseload the pressure on India to invest more on nuclear and invest more on coal as a baseload, technology will be reduced. But as of now, we still require coal and nuclear to provide that baseload, electricity generating capacity.
That does seem to be the takeaway, Mr. Ramesh, the fact that coal could rise but be restrained. So in effect, as you're saying, at some point they will plateau.
As I said, we have to be on a phase down strategy. Yeah, absolutely. We have to be on a phase down strategy. We have to look at new coal technologies. Coal gasification is something that we've been talking about for a long time. In fact, When I was power minister in 2008, I had launched India's first integrated coal gasification power plant in Vijayawada. So we got to look at new ways. I mean, clean coal is a contradiction in terms. Clean coal is an oxymoron. So it's cleaner coal that we can talk about. But I would say that in the next 10 to 15 years, I can't see India completely, sort of having a policy which says we're going to be completely without coal. But we certainly have to start looking at a transition today out of coal. And that transition may be, which may take us 20 to 30 years. And it will have profound regional implications. Remember Jharkhand, remember Odisha, remember Chhattisgarh, remember parts of, Eastern Maharashtra, Central and Eastern Maharashtra. These are all, dependent very heavily on coal, livelihoods, state economies. So the political economy of a transition away from coal has to be addressed very sensitively as part of the political process.
That's the question I was coming to, Mr. Ramesh. I wanted to tie this in, if I may, with the current coal crisis, where till the end, one was not sure what exactly the crisis was, because one side said something and the central government said something. Around these targets that have been set for coal, does it look achievable, particularly given the center-state relationship at this point and how fractured it is in many states? Do we have our act together in terms of what we are doing with coal and what we intend to do, simply put?
Well, frankly, I was completely puzzled by how suddenly the coal crisis erupted, because all along we had been told that coal production was growing healthily. There was no problem. There were no strikes. There were occasional problems here and there, but on land acquisition and compensation for the land being acquired, but those were being addressed. But all of a sudden, this crisis erupted, and I'm frankly still not very clear as to what the immediate background to this crisis was. Although some experts like Anil Swarup, who was, coal secretary, around 2014, 2015, he has written extensively on the background to this coal crisis. It was really, he say it was the mismanagement of Coal India that led to, by the government, that led to this crisis. However, I think the question that you raise is very important. I think we have to start thinking about this because it is a federal issue. It is a center state issue. These are also relatively poor states. Odisha, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh. These are not the Maharashtras, Gujarats, Karnatakas, and so on. And if you look at the energy map of India today, the energy map of India today is, Jharkhand, Odisha, Chhattisgarh, parts of Maharashtra around Chandrapur, northern Telangana. But if you look at the energy map 25, 30 years from now, you'll find all the solar capacity coming up largely in Rajasthan, Gujarat, on the western side. So the political economy of the transition is very, very important. And the dependence on the states, on revenues, on coal revenues, royalty revenues, these states are very dependent. And frankly, we should be looking at, where we will be in 2025, 2030, 2035, 2040. This 2070 is, far in the far distant future. There's another point, Mitali, which I wish to stress on the Prime Minister's announcements. See, there is a domestic context to these global announcements as well. You cannot be liberalizing your environmental laws. You cannot be liberalizing your forest conservation laws. You cannot be loosening your coastal regulations, the coastal zone regulations. You cannot be emasculating your regulatory institutions. And at the same time say that I'm going to keep up my international commitments. So I find this really the most problematic part of the Prime Minister's statement, in statements in Glasgow. He projected India as a responsible environmental player from a carbon point of view, from a climate change point of view. But environment is more than climate change. There are other issues on environment which is on our agenda. There's pollution, there is ozone depletion, there is deforestation, there is ocean acidification, there is aerosol particulate matter. There are a whole host of issues. So I think, while the international announcements have got the headlines, what matters is what is the architecture domestically for meeting your environmental objectives. And I'm afraid there we are falling horribly short. And in the name of economic recovery, we have already liberalized labor laws. I think the next target is the liberalization of environmental laws.
How do you think this dissonance will be read, Mr. Ramesh? As you said, there are commitments that were made at COP, and now there are, more than 14 aspects of the forest legislation that seek to be changed, something that is actually really protected from deforestation. As you said, it's one hand is talking to someone else and the other hand is talking to the other.
Well, I think, frankly, Mr. Modi looks at governance as a one-day match. So it was a one day in Glasgow where, he got a big bang announcements. He made these 5 announcements. Although to be fair, these out of the 5 announcements, there were only 4 major announcements. One announcement was a derivative. When he said that 1 billion tons of emissions will be cut by the year 2030, that is a consequence of having renewable energy capacity at 500 gigawatts by 2030. And by reducing the emissions intensity, you're automatically going to be cutting your emissions by 1 billion tons. So that was not an independent announcement, but whatever it is, the Pancha Amrit that he spoke about got him the headlines that day. But the real nitty-gritties is what is happening when Parliament opens. We are having proposals for liberalizing the environmental impact assessment notification. We are having proposals for liberalizing the forest conservation laws, coastal regulation, zone rules, and the National Green Tribunal, has over the past few months, systematic efforts to completely weaken it or strangulate it. So yes, you've used the right word. There is dissonance. On the one hand, we are claiming international leadership, and I think that was done deliberately in order to keep international pressure away from India. India should not be seen as the bad boy on the global stage, that we are seen to be a constructive player, which is all very good. And I subscribe to that view, that we should be seen to be part of the solution and not part of the problem, although we may not have created the problem in the first place. But for me, Mitali, the more critical, the more urgent issue is this: what we are doing domestically and how we are really systematically weakening the architecture of regulations that we have put in place for environment and forests.
Let me ask you then, how do you see the next few years panning out, Mr. Ramesh, in a context where, as you said, there were no nitty-gritties on what happens, for example, for surface transport, what happens for infrastructure in terms of attacking, specific verticals. Equally, the fact that India actually stands more vulnerable than many other countries in terms of climate change and heat, more specifically. How do you see the next few years panning out?
Well, I'm just looking at the philosophy of this government is that we will invest aggressively on solar. We're all very well. We will push electric vehicles and electric mobility, all very well. But at the same time, we will redo environmental rules. We will redo the forest laws. We will, we won't, in fact, now the language is, they're now thinking of bringing an Environmental Management Act. They want to change the Environment Protection Act to Environment Management Act. I mean, the change of the word itself is symbolic of the mindset. And the proposal is to have just one law rather than have multiple laws. I mean, it is in the nature of the subject that you have to have multiple laws. You have to have an environmental law. You have to have a law for forests. You have to have a law for tribal rights. So I see the next few years, India will be aggressive on solar. India will be aggressive on green technology. India will be aggressive on electric vehicles, but India will also be aggressive in loosening environmental laws. India will also be aggressive in loosening forest laws. And the justification for that will be we must recover, we must have economic growth, and we must we must get back to the 7% or 8% growth trajectory. And labor, the labor laws were the first target, and now environmental laws. In the next 6 months, I expect a major assault on the environmental regulatory architecture. It's already begun, but I expect a major assault. And they've muzzled the voices of civil society. They've muzzled the voices of all the civil society groups or activists who would otherwise have taken a very strong position in opposition to these changes in laws and regulations.
And given the way things progressed with, for example, the farm laws in Parliament, are you hopeful of any debate or dialogue around this, or do you think a lot of it might just
well,
get through?
We have, I chair the Standing Committee on Environment and Forests. If they are bringing amendments to laws, we will have an opportunity of examining these changes in the committee. But if they do it through executive action, then of course all we can do is to raise the issues as part of the debate in Parliament. But I really can't see right now. The argument that is being made is we need a V-shaped recovery. We need a faster recovery. We need to get back on the 8%, 7.5%, 8% growth trajectory. Let's see what are all the impediments to growth and investment. And quite wrongly, in my view, quite myopically, environment has been identified as a bottleneck for faster growth. But at the same time, we are talking of sustainability. We are talking of ecological growth. We are talking of meeting our international commitments. So remember, Mitali, the Paris Agreement has two pillars. The Paris Agreement has a bottom-up pledge pillar, that countries make pledges on their own. But there is a top-down monitoring and reporting and verification architecture that has not been finalized as yet. Now, once that gets finalized, then we will have more international accountability, more international, reporting of the progress on the pledges that we have made. Right now, we are making the pledges and we are reporting what we have done, without anybody asking any questions. But if you really look at the Paris Agreement gives the freedom to countries to make their nationally determined contributions or commitments. But it also says that there must be an international system which is credible for monitoring, reporting, and verification of these commitments. That is expected to be finalized in Glasgow. So let's see what is the final product that comes out of Glasgow.
Indeed, and the biggest irony is, as much as we may hack the environmental laws, I think any economist worth his or her salt will tell you we will still not hit those figures or that V-shaped recovery. But thank you very much, Mr. Ramesh, for joining in today and speaking with me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mitali.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.